Thanks very much, Campbell. I know this is one of the last talks of the day, so I'm not going to sort of bombard you with heaps and heaps of data. I've got lots of pictures in my slides instead, and hopefully sit back and just enjoy. There are a few pieces of data, but not too much. The other thing I'm going to do is answer the previous speaker's question, which is a bit weird, I know. But the whole idea of like transitioning from, say, possum fur harvesting to some other thing like regional tourism benefits is something that I think would be really interesting for someone to look at, because clearly, you know, we can't rely on pest animals forever, but I guess there'll be lots of other potential tourism opportunities in the regions, I guess, if we have lots of birds and other wildlife. Anyway, that's just a personal opinion. So back to my topic at hand. Campbell and the team at Cape to City asked me and quite a few other people more than a year ago now to have a look at what are the potential perverse outcomes, not just in this region, but, you know, as we start to think about predator-free New Zealand. And again, we've heard a lot about the technical aspects of pests and pest control over the last couple of days, and also a lot about people and the social side of it, and the leadership and ownership by tangata whenua as well, which is great. And now we've heard about the economic side of it from Bruce, so I'm going to sort of extend that again to the ecological side of it. So we all know there are interactions amongst pest mammals in our ecosystems, and we also know that they impact on, like, eat or whatever, native flora and fauna. And so what I've done is done a bit of a trawl through the literature really on what's available and what's known, and possibly equally importantly what's not known about this. And just at the end, I've been sort of cogitating in the last few months about a kind of framework that we could put all this together in and figure out what the knowledge gaps are in such a way that we can start measuring stuff properly to quantify the benefits and the perversities. So one of the reasons for this, of course, is the idea of predator-free New Zealand. What's particularly interesting about predator-free New Zealand when you think about it is that it's focused on those three mammal pests or groups of pests, so rats, possums and stoats. And that leaves a whole heap of other things in our ecosystems in New Zealand that aren't necessarily the focus like those top three are, which is not necessarily a problem, but we do need to be aware of the responses of some of the other species in those ecosystems. And so just to remind you, the 2025 goal for predator-free was that, which is pretty interesting, no pressure. And I guess the scale and the speed of control, whether it's these novel over-the-horizon technologies that people keep talking about, or actually just scaling up business as usual, like we're seeing here in the Bay right now, I think landscape scale is where it's going to be at. And so the scale and the speed at which this is coming at us is really quite unique. And that means we do need to start thinking about the whole ecosystem. And of course, predator-free New Zealand internationally generated a heap of interest when it was announced last year. So it went into this international scientific magazine called Science. New Zealand's mind-blowing goal being rat-free by 2050. So internationally it got a lot of press. It was in The Economist, it was in The Guardian. Someone in The Economist said, no one can accuse New Zealand's government of a lack of ambition, and I thought that was quite funny because actually quite a lot of people have accused various governments of a lack of ambition over the years, but anyway. And then closer to home, Kennedy Warren in the New Zealand Geographic said, is this our moonshot? And that is a term that had also been used by the late Sir Paul Callaghan. And then, of course, something that you might expect from the Cacophony Project would be, they said, bold, ballsy, and just the sort of thing we should do, but it's not ambitious enough because surely we could do it by 2040 instead. And then of course, there was Gareth Morgan and his blog. So he says rats, possums, and stoats, and then couldn't help himself, could he? What about the cats? And Radio New Zealand did quite an interesting little blog piece as well, saying the war on pests avoids targeting pets and dinner. So people were starting to think about other species and the implications more widely than just the top three predators that have been mentioned. So to put this in a kind of framework, a bunch of us have thought about what, the different aspects of what you would look at. I guess there's three main things that we've thought of so far. Removing the three main pests may alter interactions amongst the invasive mammals in our ecological communities. Obviously, it will also alter the impacts on our native flora and fauna, and it's going to alter what's called other trophic interactions. So interactions between trophic levels in a food web just simply, for example, might alter competitive interactions between pest species, or it might alter predation, and it may alter some other processes that I'll come to in a minute. So things like seed dispersal is an ecosystem process that we might be interested in. For this study, we've focused only on ecological responses. Otherwise, where would you draw the line? We know there's lots of social outcomes, both potentially perverse outcomes if people get hot under the collar about gene technologies, for example. That's the kind of thing we are going to have to talk about as a nation as well, but we've focused on the ecological outcomes. So first of all, I'm going to focus on the potential changes in interactions amongst invasive mammal species. So for those of you that have seen some of the work that we've done previously in Manaaki Whenua land care research, we've done quite a lot of thinking about how all these species interact in New Zealand's ecosystems. So this is our sort of idea conceptually of a forest food web. So we've got the top level predators, the stoats at the top, and then quite a lot of people term rats and mice mesopredators. And possums are sort of a bit unique too, because they're a herbivore or an omnivore as well as a mesopredator. And then there are bottom-up drivers like climate driving seeds and fruits. And I'll actually come back to that a little bit down the track, because there are other things that may alter interactions amongst these mammals that involve climate drivers as well. So it's not just our invasive species that we're having to manage here, it's also some of these other global drivers like climate change. And then there are obviously impacts on native birds and invertebrates. And then for me personally, this is quite interesting. This is our grassland or dryland food web. And having worked a lot with people like Grant Norbury over the years, we quickly realised that actually the dryland food webs are really quite complicated. They're possibly even more complex than our forest food webs in New Zealand, because they seem to have even more species, and there are a number of species there that we haven't even listed, like hedgehogs. But certainly the same thing, top three predators in this case, ferrets, stoats and cats, but also mice as the mesopredators, and then the herbivores like rabbits, and again I'll come to those in a minute. And also driven bottom up by things like climate, land use, pasture change, intensification and so on. And then finally we've got places like alpine areas. So there's a relatively simplistic alpine food web that we've also drawn up to help ourselves conceptualise some of these issues. I will acknowledge that there are other ecosystem types that we have in this country, like, for example, coastal ecosystems, especially around Auckland and Northland, and just because I haven't conceptualised them here doesn't mean that we haven't dredged through the scientific literature to have a look at what was out there. So by far and away, I actually asked a whole bunch of colleagues, what's the thing you think of when you think of a potential perverse ecological outcome around predator-free or removal of top predators? And almost everybody said mice first, which is kind of not surprising. They are the thing that's in everyone's minds, especially the sanctuaries people who are removing who are removing the top predators and lots of other species. The thing that they really struggle to get rid of, as many of us know, are mice. And certainly mice are potentially a problem. So some of you may have seen this, these data presented by Deb Wilson, John Innes and Corin Watts and others who have been working in Maungatautari, and especially when they did a treatment switch between the inside and the outside of that sanctuary and removing the top predators, you get a really significant change in mouse populations depending on whether the top predators are present or absent. So that's a real thing. That's in a forest ecosystem. And then in a dryland ecosystem, just bear with me, Grant Norbury and others also looked at the complexities of mouse responses in a dryland ecosystem in the presence and absence of the top predators. So a few years ago we did an experiment where we actually did remove the top predators in that dryland ecosystem, and we were looking at the responses of things like mice and lizards and so on. And so this is a very complex ecosystem because you've got land use change going on, land use intensification, which impacts on rabbits, which also impacts on the predators in the system. And then you've also got different kinds of ecosystems. So you've got a very pulsed ecosystem resource-wise at places like McRae's Flat, where you have native tussock grasslands. So when I say pulsed resource-wise, I mean that every few years we get a tussock mast, but in between it's kind of lean pickings for something like a mouse. Whereas in places like Alexandra, where they've got introduced pasture grasses, those grasses are seeding and flourishing every year. And so you get that boost, that resource boost into the ecosystem every year. And so depending on that combination of annual or pulsed resource events from the bottom up, the food supply for the mice, and then whether or not we'd removed the predators, we modelled the responses of the mouse populations based on our empirical measurements. We modelled those out for 100 years, and this is what we get. So in the top right-hand corner here, if you have low predator abundance and high seed abundance, especially every year, you get a lot more mice. So indeed, it does seem that in a few ecosystem types in New Zealand, we are going to get a mouse problem if we're not paying attention to it. Doesn't mean we can't deal with it, but it is worth knowing about. And then we had various other combinations on these different plots here. So here's the one with high predator abundance, potentially keeping the lid on the mice in some ecosystems, in some circumstances, but then with not much food supply, they didn't have a lot to go on. And then Wendy Rusko and others did a similar experiment in a forest ecosystem. So that got even more complex, and I'm not really going to go through all of these little combinations and permutations in these little boxes here, except to say that the open bars here are pre-control of, in this case, possums. And then what she did was she also looked at a stoat removal area, possum removal area, rat-only removal area, and then looked at the mouse responses. And so we've got some responses of these different species in the system, and they do different things. For example, again, here's your mice down here, pre and after control, just depending on whether there are the top predators in the system. So it's complex. We get all sorts of different permutations and combinations of what happens to the other animals in the system. And again, it doesn't mean that we can't deal with it, but we need to understand these interactions in order to be able to put mitigations in place. And a few of us have took that a step further and sort of used that data that was collected in the experimental context to then put into a conceptual model. So here's a slightly different representation of that same food web that I showed you before in our conceptual model. And we actually put the actual data, the actual parameters from the experiments into this model and then ran it out over, I think it was a 100-year period, and you'll see that in a minute. So we used and what we did with this one, this comes to the little bit that I was going to tell you about, the potential climate change interaction as well here. So what we did is we took the masting information from the Orongorongo Valley. So this is beach masting in Orongorongo Valley near Wellington, for those of you that know it. We all know that there's a temperature effect on those masting events, and so you get the heavy seed fall if there's a strong difference in temperature from one year to the next. And so every few years you get this really big pulse in resources, food resources for mice and rats into the ecosystem. But what was interesting when we looked at these data was that if you kind of squint and have a look, you can see that the first sort of 25 odd years of that data set seems to have fewer masting events over that time period than in the second half. And so we actually, we then projected that into the future and said, well, what if it's not every sort of 3 years or something, but if masting events occur even more frequently, say every 2 years. So we've got our initial conditions here, and that's how we set up our model as initial conditions, contemporary conditions, which we called the last, most recent 25 years. And then we also modelled out into the future, something that we can't know. So I was wrong for those of you that remembered the 100-year thing. We modelled this for a 20-year time period, hypothetically into the future. So we've got all our mice, our rats, and our stoats set up in our computer simulation model, but based on real data from ecosystems that we know of in New Zealand. And we looked at this for a whole bunch of species responses. And I'm not going to go through all the different panels here. I'm actually only going to focus on this panel here that's in blue, because that's all you really need to know about. So again, just a reminder, our initial conditions were the white, contemporary conditions are in light grey, and then our potential future climate change conditions are in dark grey. And what we found was that, as you can see, this is shipwreck responses. This is the unmanaged condition, and then various types of control that I won't go into. So we were lucky on one kind of optimistic control. It looks like we can keep a lid on the shipwrecks, even with those various climate change scenarios. But as soon as you start looking at the other species in the system, and that comes back to our taking that predator lid off some of these other populations, you start to get even responses of things like mice that are exacerbated by things like climate change. And then it was the same with when you look at the stoats in the system. So again, probably because there were projected hypothetically to be more mice in the system with the removal of top predators, it's harder to keep a lid on the stoats under that kind of a scenario. Okay, so that's just a little walk through some of the things that are happening in forest ecosystems. Not to depress you too much, it's just to be aware of these things and how we deal with them in future scenarios. A couple of people, so the title of this talk that Campbell wrote for me, again, obviously, was Predators, and I know that there have been a couple of people have mentioned, rabbits, have mentioned rabbit issues over the last couple of days. The paper that Roger Peck referred to earlier today really is the one to pay attention to. So Grant Norbury and Chris Jones took a look at both New Zealand and Australian conditions and the potential responses of rabbit populations in the absence of predators. There's not actually a lot of evidence that when you remove the predators, you're going to get a massive rabbit response. We don't know for certain, as Campbell said. I think he referred to that sometime this afternoon. So we're not 100% sure about how these ecosystems are going to respond, and there are probably lots of you out there who are thinking, but I know of situations when we've removed predators and had a rabbit response. And I guess our point simply is that there are a lot of other things going on around climate and food supply that really drive rabbit populations, especially in dry ecosystems in places like Hawke's Bay. And so those are probably equally as, if not more important drivers based on the scientific evidence that we have so far. And then the other thing that we need to know something about, if we're looking at what happens when we remove top predators, is behavioural responses, because some of those behavioural responses eventually might translate into a different breeding response. So in this case, we had a student a few years ago who looked, from Otago University, who looked at these things called giving up densities, or GUDs, of rats in the presence and absence of stoats. So giving up densities are these things where you put a little seed tray out in the forest, and it's got a pile of seeds and some sand. And the rats have to dig around in the sand to find the seeds and eat them. And the longer that takes for them to find the seeds, the more difficult it is for them to find all the seeds if they're scared of having the predators eat them effectively. So it's a nice way of doing an experiment to look at the indirect or behavioural effects of predators on prey populations. And what we found was that the number of seeds in the seed trays when the predators were present, in other words, the stoats were present, there were heaps of seeds in these seed trays. So these are the average number of seeds remaining. And that means that the rats weren't venturing out away from the tree trunks. So this is in a tree trunk up 1.5 metres into a tree on the ground, and then out in the open on the ground. And you can see that in all of those situations, and particularly, for example, in the tree trunk, there was a really strong response of rats to the presence of stoats. If the stoats were present, they weren't likely to venture out, and there were heaps of seeds left in the seed trays. But if the stoats were not present, then the rats came and scoffed a lot. So that's another piece of the puzzle here, I guess. And then, of course, there is the question that's been raised. I think somebody raised it, and questioned Campbell about this earlier in the day, was about the potential responses of things like feral cats if we're only dealing with the top 3 predators that we're talking about around the predator-free New Zealand goal. And I think, not to say that places like Cape City aren't dealing with feral cats, as we know, but it does beg the question of whether we should pay more attention to feral cats. There actually really is not a lot of published evidence out there in the literature for exactly how feral cats will respond in the absence of those other predators, that the top 3 at least for predator-free New Zealand. I don't know we couldn't find very many studies that looked at that. And then, of course, there are other predators again, things like hedgehogs, which Sanders and Maloney observed on braided riverbeds back in 2002, that they actually have a pretty big impact on ground nesting braided river birds. So these are, again, and so hedgehogs have a big impact on things like snails and New Zealand native earthworms and lizards and other species, invertebrates species in the ecosystem. But again, the evidence for what would happen when you remove the top predators in terms of, say, hedgehog impacts was very, very difficult to quantify based on the literature that's been published in New Zealand so far. So the next part of the equation was to look at, okay, well, so those are some of the issues around interactions between our predators in our ecosystems, or our introduced species in our ecosystems. What about the impacts on native flora and fauna? How might those change? And again, I come back to the study that was done by Wendy Rusco and a team of thousands back in the mid-2000s, or late 2000s, where they looked at, and this is not a very good graph, I'm sorry, because you actually are probably not able to see the crucial piece of information on there, which is a grey shaded area right here for each of these graphs. And so these are the control sites so these are different invertebrate species. So these are this is rat abundance at the top here, and the responses of 4 different invertebrates in each of these panels down the slide. And then looking across the slide, we've got control sites, experimental control sites, and then short-term removal of rats and long-term removal of rats, or suppression of rats long-term. And I guess the key point here is, because you can't see those grey shaded areas very well, I'll just say that there was an extremely strong response of weta, a conic invertebrate species, when those rats were removed. But there wasn't a lot of responses in other invertebrates in the system that are actually potentially quite important in terms of ecosystem function. So things like spiders, for example, didn't respond hardly at all. We don't really know how that's going to impact on ecosystem function overall. And then coming back to that study where we looked at mouse impacts in drylands, again, we also found a really strong response of something like lizards in the absence of predators in some grassland situations, but not in others. And again, it was entirely dependent not only on the removal of the top predators, but also that pulsed food resource in the dryland ecosystems, and whether it was introduced pasture grasses like this example on the left here, or whether it was native tussock grassland like at McRae's Flat, for example. So again, really complex responses in some of these ecosystems in response to the removal of top predators. And then just one more piece of information. Again, we also know that what we did was a study where we looked at what they call the functional responses of in this case rats and mice, to locusts in a dryland ecosystem, locusts as a surrogate wetter, and we found that there's a really strong response. So if you have more, quote, wetter in the ecosystem, you're going to get a much stronger response of both rats and mice to the wetter. And what that means is that, again, if you are removing one or the other species or their top predators, you could get impacts on native flora and fauna either directly or indirectly through some of those behavioural responses or both. I think I might skip this one and go straight to looking at other trophic interactions. So the final thing that Campbell and the team asked us to look at was whether there is much evidence published for things like impacts of, I'm looking at the next, this thing has 2 slides up here. Impacts of things like native birds on orchards or crops and other perverse outcomes like that. And again, when you look around the literature in New Zealand, at the moment there's very little evidence. There's one PhD thesis out of the University of Wellington looking at the impacts of kaka in urban areas, and there are some possible issues around kaka impacts on urban fruit trees, and they're perceived as a bit of a nuisance by some people, but mostly not. Mostly people like them in their gardens, and there doesn't seem to be a really major impact. There was very little evidence for, in fact, there was no published evidence for how things like native birds might respond for the horticultural sector. There's known impacts of pukeko on pasture, for example. Farmers don't like them, but at the same time, again, there wasn't a lot of evidence of the economic impact, for example. And there also wasn't a lot of evidence when we looked at birds dispersing weed seeds. So this is a graph from a couple of people that looked at whether bird dispersers were dispersing native or non-native seeds. So this is the non-native fruit in the diet of these different endemic or sort of native or non-native bird species. And non-native birds tended to spread a lot of weed seeds compared to the native birds. So that's actually kind of good in the sense that if there are more native birds in the system, then we're more likely to get native seeds being spread. And then finally, I just want to mention that I guess this is probably all still better than doing nothing at all. And that's the context I just want to finish off in. So Camel's given me the 1 minute thing. Lots to talk about here, but this is a study by Josh Kemp and Graham Elliott from DOC, where they actually looked at the response to the Battle for Our Birds project. And overall, for example, these large-scale predator control situations do have a positive impact on native flora and fauna compared to if you do nothing. I'm going to skip through the last couple of slides and finish off. So, as we said, the focus on the top 3 might alter interactions amongst invasive mammals, it might produce unwanted impacts on native biota, and it might alter other trophic interactions. But doing nothing is not an option either. And so really it's a matter of setting this up in some kind of a framework. And so what we think so far is that managing multiple pests at once is probably a really good thing to do. And if that's not possible, then deciding on that sequence of removal and trying to do the key impacts, key species that are having major impacts beyond the top 3, so things like hedgehogs and cats, are probably a priority. So considering other predators and herbivores and omnivores is really important. Integration with other restoration activities, like, for example, planting or translocations, is going to be critical. And there's a lot of learning to be done, as I mentioned yesterday, from all the projects like Cape to City that are happening around New Zealand. And as I mentioned at the end, there are social and other regulatory and other policy drivers that are in play here, but we didn't look at those. So this is a bit of an oldie now, but a goodie. I thought I'd just put it up because there are still those people out there who think that this might not happen. But on the other hand, just to finish off, this is what we're really aiming for. It's not actually predator-free New Zealand, it's just invasive predator-free New Zealand. So thanks.